It's a good question. Welcome to Dialogue that Enlarges, bridging ideological divides through a faith lens. I'm Allison Ralph. I am the interim director of the Inclusive America Project of the Aspen Institute. In our current political moment, it's tempting to ask whether the American experiment for multi-religious, multiracial, and multi-ethnic nation will survive. It's a good question. Currently, the national conversation around religion and politics is both polarized and toxic. Narratives tend to be extreme and one-sided. Individual, political, religious, and moral identities are subsumed into categories of good and evil. In this context, Americans avoid talking about religion and politics, fearing disagreement, and we avoid disagreement, fearing argument. But avoidance only cedes the public square to the loudest, most extreme, and most polarizing voices. And we cannot cede the public square, or we risk losing it entirely. We must be willing to talk religion and politics, and we can learn to argue better. The Inclusive America Project, along with our partners at Better Arguments and IFYC, and our friends Rabbi Holzman and Reverend Jock, believe that religious communities and traditions can ground us in relationship with our neighbor and can teach us both humility and courage in the face of deep disagreement. Religious communities and traditions, often part of what divides us, also offer tools to bridge those divides. For many Americans, their faith informs their moral framework, and understanding that framework helps us to argue better. Faith communities often span ideological, gender, and generational barriers, and as such, offer opportunities to strengthen dialogue, diversity, and democracy in the context of loving community relationships. Also, many faith traditions hold sacred tenets about engaging with those with whom we differ. And as the Rebuilding Democracy Project study shows, religious traditions such as textual study and liturgy can help frame difficult political issues as sacred and worthy of sacred care. Today, we'll explore resources and learn from leaders who are building pluralism today in and through their communities of faith. The Rebuilding Democracy report emerged from a multi-year program at the Northern Virginia Hebrew congregation to explore how specific aspects of Judaism's traditions apply to difficult American political conversations. Our workbook, Dialogue that Enlarges, co-created for faith communities with Better Arguments Project and IFYC, provides prompts and tangible strategies to explore your own and others' moral frameworks, to learn to argue better instead of just louder. To get our conversation started, I'm excited to introduce our moderator, Reverend Billy Michael Honor, Inclusive America Project's Fellow for Racial Justice and Religion. Billy.
Thank you, Allison. Certainly appreciate your introduction, and thank you for welcoming us all into this conversation. So welcome to everyone. Happy Wednesday, and we're so very happy to have you with us today for this really important conversation that we're going to have. I'm certainly overjoyed to be here with our wonderful conversation partners and guests. And I say our because we hope that in this hour that we have, that all of us will be in conversation together about what is an important topic, talking about how it is that we can argue better. And it's a topic that we don't give much attention to, I think, enough in public discourse, but it's a really important tool in civic life. It's a really important tool just in relational life. And I'm really happy that we're going to have opportunity to engage the subject matter, especially in this time that we're living in that can seem most polarizing. And the response to the polarization can seemingly be to retreat and just say, well, I'm not going to participate in that conversation. And we all know people who've just decided to retreat and not be involved in hard conversations, whether it has to do with politics or social life or religion, or there are people who have just decided that they'll opt for a sort of civility, which they seem to understand is the absence of conflict. But the truth of the matter is that we know that neither of those options are optimal. Neither of those options are where we really want to be as engaged citizens. We have to learn how to engage in hearing opposing ideas and being able to, as the topic of this whole conversation says, enlarge the discourse, right? And so I have two wonderful people here who are going to talk about how we do this as they now turn on their cameras and join us here today. I have two wonderful, wonderful faith leaders, starting with Rabbi Michael Hoseman, who is the rabbi at the Northern Virginia Hebrew Congregation, and he's been there since July 2010. He's an inspirational and compassionate spiritual leader, has a strong commitment to Jewish education, youth programming, and social action, and is known by a great many to be someone who is highly innovative, energetic, and has successfully found ways to make his faith tradition accessible and exciting to those that he encounters. Rabbi Michael, we're very glad to have you here with us today.
Thank you so much.
And we also have the Rev Dr Xena Jock, who is with us today. And she is an accomplished minister and speaker. She has pastored the Community Church of Barrington since 2007, but has recently accepted a new call to serve on the leadership team of the historic Alfred Street Baptist Church, a highly influential and respected congregation in the DMV area. So if you're in the DMV area, you ought to find a way to welcome Reverend Xena to the area, and certainly check out the work she'll be doing there with small groups. But in addition to pastoring, she has also done extensive work in the areas of research, counseling, support programs, and has participated in many workshops like in forums such as this, and is just a wonderful servant of her God. And so we're really glad to have you with us, Reverend Xena.
It is a privilege.
So this conversation today, as you both know, is about how it is we can argue better, right, in community. And as I was thinking about this conversation, I recalled in my mind my college president of the Bible college that I attended. He's a man by the name of Dr. Samuel R. Chan. And he used to say that me and my wife don't have arguments. We have a vigorous exchange of opposing ideas. That's what he used to say. And I thought about it in the sense that why was it necessary for him to make that distinction to us, right? There was a sense in which he felt that there was something negative about saying you had an argument, right? Even with people who you have to live with, and we know living with people ain't easy. Most of us are gonna have disagreements and arguments. I mean, that should be commonplace. But even in the context of talking about lifelong commitment of relationship with someone, it was in his mind, I need to reframe this. Don't call this an argument, call it something else, right? Which says that in our culture, the idea of arguing, or really what we really mean is presenting a different point of view than someone we're in conversation with, has become really a subject of tension. And what I really want to begin this conversation with today is to talk to both of you all and get your viewpoints about what really is going on in our culture that we're having so much trouble in terms of how it is we disagree one to another, right? And I'll start with you, Rabbi Hoseman, if you could talk a little bit about and it could relate to your experience well as a faith leader of your congregation too.
Well, it's a broad question. What's going on in our culture that's leading to this toxicity and in the way that we disagree? I think that we have forgotten how to disagree constructively, how to hold two opposing ideas in our minds without our brains exploding. And that's a skill. That's a habit that we have to cultivate as human beings. And it's hard to do that when we feed ourselves an information diet of, tiny snippets of text or even memes or videos. When we reduce an argument to a meme, we don't give ourselves the exercise in balancing conflicting ideas. And so I think part of what's happening right now in the last decade or so has been an acceleration of forces towards toxicity due to technology. Someone I was on a panel recently, talked about how the algorithms that our technology is built upon, all those algorithms are fed only by simple binary choices, non-complex. He called them non-complex binary choices. That's how the algorithms are fed. Well, if our brains are used to non-complex binary choices, it's pretty hard to learn how to listen to somebody else and how to disagree. So I think that's part of it. But these trends towards toxicity have been going on for a few decades now in our political space. I just think technology has accelerated it.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you so much for that. Certainly, I think social media and technology more broadly has a big role to play in the ways in which these things play out. Being trolled has become a thing, like online, and people being bullied, cyber bullied, and all those sorts of things are so relevant here. And I love the F. Fitzgerald Scott quote there about the mind, first class mind, being able to hold two opposing thoughts in one mind. I think Reverend Xena, Rabbi is laying out some really important things here in terms of what many of us know, that in the broader society, there are these ideas around social media and technology that create a more toxic situation than we may have had in previous times. But we know that even that this isn't new, right? That prior generations have also dealt with this. Is there something about the human condition? Is there something? I mean, what is it about arguing and disagreement that we struggle with so much that we can't find positive and constructive ways to disagree from your viewpoint?
My mom used to say, you can't be what you haven't seen. And she reminded us, I have a sister, she reminded us that role models were really important, that values aren't taught, they're caught. You've heard that before. And when I think about our national discourse, where have we seen really good examples of being able to disagree, to argue, and to remain colleagues and esteemed colleagues? Where have we seen the absence of name calling? Where have we seen the opportunity for someone to say, that opened up a new vista. I've learned, I've changed my mind. Now, if you are a person of note in our world and you say you change your mind, they start throwing sandals at you. So we have eliminated from our visual scheme the ability to even see a role model. And I really think that is significant. The other thing is, I remember I was a teenager when I learned how to swim. And I remember my dad teaching me first how to float, so that I would have comfort in the water. But the difference in floating and diving, going really under the water, this was a lake, I wasn't in danger, but just giving up my ability to see above the waterline and was scary because I didn't know what was down there and I didn't know what I would meet. So I wanted to float for the rest of my life and not go underwater. And I think that becomes a metaphor that in our world, we don't know what people think. It's a terrible cycle. We don't know what people think. So we stay shallow because we're afraid if we go deeper, we'll find something that means I have to break relationship with you. And we don't go deeper. And we just are caught in this shallow, polite, civil discourse. But there is more underneath the water than there is above the water on our earth. The riches and the beauty and the power of creation and recreation and the ingenuity of whomever called this into being is much under the water more than above. And what we are losing by our inability to trust our ability to go deep, to practice our ability to go deep, will kill our souls. So but I want to say Rabbi Houtsman said we have to learn how to do this. We have to practice. And I fear we don't have very many spaces to practice. And maybe that's why our religious communities are so important.
Yeah, no, and thank you for the segue. I mean, I think part of what we're here to dialogue about is the assumption that faith communities offer constructive sites to do this type of work that you're describing, right? And that's what we want to get into and talk a bit about. I'm going to come to you in a moment, Rabbi Holzman. I also want to let everybody know that we're going to continue to talk for a little bit more, and then we're going to have a Q&A with everyone. So if you're out there watching, find the Q&A box, and want you to be sure to begin to drop your questions in that Q&A box so that we can hopefully get to some of them a little later. So just be mindful of that. But Rabbi Holzman, so what about this question of faith communities? What about this question of, are they good sites for doing this type of work that both of you have been describing? What do you think? What say you?
Well, I think that absolutely. I mean, I think that's what I've built, we've built this project on here, but I don't think it should be assumed. I mean, Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in America. Church politics, synagogue politics are some of the most notoriously ugly politics. People every family could probably tell a story of someone who dropped out of a church or a synagogue or a mosque or something because they didn't like the politics. So it's not obvious or natural. And I think what we talked about earlier with civility, and the siren song of civility applies to clergy as well, pastors and rabbis. We want to avoid conflict in our institutions. And so it's pretty tough to lead an institution and to grow an organization and do all the things you have to do when you're running a church or synagogue or faith institution when you're dealing with politics. And so a lot of times it's just much easier to just keep things civil. Let's take the complicated topic and we'll put it into a committee or a working group or a task force. They'll go over here in the dark. No one will see them. And then they'll come back with a report and we'll hope no one notices. And I think those kinds of practices happen all the time in faith institutions. And faith institutions are local. There are places where people have an opportunity to be in a place that Reverend Jock just talked about, a contained environment where a community gets to say, these are our values. And let's practice using those values on hard topics. Let's not keep them in the dark. Let's bring those hard topics out into the public. And it could just be an internal topic. I don't mean we have to have big national debates. I mean, like, let's talk about the parking lot, and people are very passionate about parking lots, and then bring it out in the open and practice the skills. That's why I think faith communities have this great potential, because they're so retail and there's so many of them. And there are more faith communities than there are churches and Starbucks and post offices. I mean, schools, Starbucks, post offices combined, right? In America. And so these are places where people can practice these skills, but the leaders have to be mindful of what's happening. This is citizenship writ small, and people need to realize that we aren't healthy in the way we practice citizenship in America, and we have to reteach it. Clergy can do that. Faith leaders, lay leaders can do that.
Yeah, I love that you couch this as a matter of what it means to be a citizen. I've long believed we need to go back to doing more talking about citizenship classes in schools. What does it mean? You also said something that I was saying in my spirit, amen, and that is that too many of our religious traditions, I know this is true of the ordination, of the denomination of my ordination. Anytime there's a tough situation, we defer it to committee to study, right? So the way in which we deal with things is to study it, right? And I think there's some good things about that, but there are also some problematic things that gets back to us. I just think not knowing how to resolve conflict and tension. And so Reverend Jock, I mean, Rabbi Holzman has laid out some wonderful things for us. I want you to respond to this question too about how faith communities are they good sites, but I also want to add something to this, and that is what are some of the ways that faith communities have been the opposite, have become places where people say, well, no, not at all. Like, I don't want to engage there because the ways I've seen it done have not been positive. Like, give us some stories is what I'm saying.
Well, I'll give you a story. And then, so I, as was clear in my introduction, I arrived at this church in 2007. We are a Baptist church. It is in a community that is 89% white, 85% white. The church is comprised of white men and women, with the exception of me and, prior to his death, my husband. So there was a cross-cultural thing going on because they hired me. But I want to go back to something Rabbi Holzman said. You have to know your values. They become the foundation on which we stand. And in a religious space, I don't get to set those values. There's a book that helps me set them, right? And so I have to go back to it and draw my values from it. And then, but there's some things we might highlight as a community. So our tagline here is committed Christians growing spiritually, serving God. Those 6 words, committed Christians growing spiritually, serving God. So in 2017, a woman showed up to do her internship here. She happens to be married to another woman. And that was a question for some of my folks. And so I love etymology. And if you look at the word argue, it means to illumine or to brighten, to shine light on. That's its etymological root. So I said, friends, I think we're going to argue. But here's what I mean by that. We're going to shine light. We're going to brighten. We're going to illumine. That's what argue means. So I'm not afraid of the arguments, as long as we know that that's what it means. And then here are these things we've said are our foundation. So here's a packet for you to read. So we were all on the same page, at least about some facts. And now we're going to have like a listening sessions. And we're going to sit in circles. Wherever we are, we're going to sit in circles. There'll be nobody at the head. We argued, lost one couple, and ordained the Reverend Alicia Thompson on the 2nd Sunday in January in 2018. But we did 4 things. We set out what those values were. We described what arguing looked like. We set some ground rules. Thank you, Krista Tippett. We took them from her project, and we tried to live by them. And we stopped and paused when we broke the rules and said, this doesn't feel right. How do we come back? Now, again, I've got a small congregation. And the reason I lift that up is because we are in relationship. We know each other. And so I cannot talk about you badly in the parking lot, because I'm going to see you in the grocery store, at the hairdresser, at the dog groomer. We are in relationship in this town of 50,000 people. And I want to play on that. I want to play that I know the best of you. And so when we disagree, when we argue, when we illumine a difference, I still know the best of you. And that thing that you might now think of me as the worst of me, you got to balance that against what you know about the best of me, because we are in relationship. And there's just one other thing that I want to say. And I just looked it up. My friend, Martin Copenhaver, wrote a book, I don't know, in 2014 called Jesus is the Question. And in this book, Martin, who's a UCC pastor, raises 307 questions Jesus asked. Well, the questions were less important to me, although I enjoyed I have used this book as a sermon series. The questions were less important than the fact that Jesus used 307 questions. Because an argument for me rises in the way the question is raised. And if I raise the question to indict you, I've already lost. I need to raise questions because I'm curious. I'm really curious. And I want to learn how you got to where you are, particularly if I disagree with you. Now, I might not, nobody may shift, but I want to understand how you got there. And if I'm not really curious, I shouldn't say I am. If I'm listening to change you, that's not curious. So that's the story. Yeah. And that young woman is going to be part of an interim team when I leave here. So just to know, it really did work.
There you go. Love. That's a great story and a great example. And thank you for sharing, and thank you for your leadership. It seems to me that what you're both describing in many ways is democratic principles, right? Like true liberal democratic ideals, and the founding of this country. This democracy in many ways was founded on a lot of the principles that you're laying out. There wasn't wholesale agreement as the founders tried to craft out this union, as imperfect as it is. They had to come to agreement. And so, Rabbi Hoseman, I know that you've been involved in this Rebuilding Democracy report, right? This idea of how it is you take the under-recognized power of congregations, and there are hundreds of thousands of them, or at least faith-based organizations, faith-inspired institutions all over, and think about the ways that faith informs our moral framework and helps to reinstill certain values in our democracy. And so I want to give you an opportunity to sort of talk about, in your context, we've heard Rev Xena talk about hers, but in your context, sort of, what has your community created, this wonderful program? And how is it playing out, and how does it relate to this theme of what we're talking about enlarging conversation?
So about 5 years ago, we went through some hard internal political issues, and that, of course, coincided with the election of 2016, which was not exactly a happy time in America. And it also coincided with a crescendo of people coming into my office to receive chaplain care, pastoral care, talking about adult children or siblings who wouldn't talk to each other, families that were fractured over political issues, Thanksgiving dinners that were disasters. All these things were happening simultaneously: the national politics, our internal politics, and this pastoral need. And so we decided we were going to start doing experiments, that basically throwing spaghetti against the wall to say, what can we do? What do we have the power to do as a synagogue to change this? And we did a number of experiments. And that, like you said, Billy, they look at democracy as a system, an ecosystem that needs nourishment. Democracy operates on different levels. There's the level of civic action, like going to the polls, lobbying an elected official, that's civic action, right? There's the level of like institutional integrity. How do our public institutions protect us, and are they fair, and are they being evaluated? And there's also the level of narrative and mythology, and what does this country mean? Who are we? What's our identity as Americans? What does it mean to be patriotic? What does that flag mean? What kind of pain does it cause some people, and what kind of pride does it cause some people? And so all these different things are happening. So we created experiments to play around with them. And one of the experiments that has been most successful and kind of illuminates what we're talking about is we decided that if we wanted to understand what it meant to be Americans, we're going to do it the Jewish way. The Jewish way is to study text, scripture, and in Judaism, especially Reform Judaism, our brand of Judaism in my synagogue, we value disagreement above everything else. The old joke, how many, you have two Jews in a room, how many opinions? You have three opinions, So, there's all kinds of stories, Jewish jokes about disagreement. The entire religion is founded upon, arguments in the Talmud, and even earlier than that between rabbis. And our tradition differentiates between arguments that happen for the sake of heaven, l'shem shamayim is the expression, and arguments that happen just out of human basic need. And when we argue l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven, those ideas persist. And the arguments that are out of our own human need, those ideas disappear. And so we said, we're going to figure out a way as a synagogue to argue l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven, about being an American. And so we decided to take great texts of America, the Declaration of Independence, what to a slave is the 4th of July, Reagan's tear down this wall speech, to take these texts and to study them like we study Torah. And we were a little crazy. We had the bold idea that we were going to remove the Torah from our normal spot on Saturday morning when we study Torah, and instead insert these great American texts. So we kept everything else the same. We have the same snacks, the same blessings, the same coffee, the same space. We act the same, we sing, we pray, we say a blessing for study, all of the different ritual elements that obtain in our Torah study time and space. We did the same stuff. We just changed the text. And by doing that, I really believe that by placing that text in that context, we made the experience sacred, and we made the argument for the sake of heaven. But we brought the religious, the spiritual together with what we call the political or the democratic or the civic into one experience. And that gave us the safety to have hard conversations, to disagree with each other, to say things that were uncomfortable, because we had this container that was so safe and familiar in a sacred space. So that's kind of one example of how we do what we do in the Rebuilding Democracy Project.
I love it. I love it. That all sounds really interesting and brilliant even. And so I'm really happy to be able to have you explain that to folks. But I have even better news, and that is that the entire report is available for all the attendees. So if you say, I didn't get all of that sounds good. That doesn't have to be the last time. So in the chat, when we began this, both reports that this conversation is centered on were placed there. And so Rabbi Holzman's Rebuilding Democracy report is there. And so please check it out. We're gonna move to some questions in just a moment, but I wanna give one last question here for Reverend Xena to close out this portion of our talk around better arguments and really practically how to do them. So the Better Arguments program, one of the partners in presenting this conversation today, the whole premise of what they do at Aspen is around how we have a healthier civic culture by embracing the idea of arguments, that we don't need to have less arguments, we need to have better arguments. I like that. And so, Reverend Xena, I really want to know, give some examples to someone who is saying it, and maybe it's in a religious context, and they say, I really just want to know how to have more difficult conversations. How do we have more constructive conversations and disagree, maybe even in a religious context? Because I know oftentimes one of the most contentious places to have disagreement is religious. This is why what people say, the things that you don't talk about at parties, politics and religion, right? It's like, oh my goodness, how did religion end up in there, right? Like, so help us, Reverend.
I think I want to just thank Rabbi Holtzman for that notion of a sacred container, because when he said that, what I heard was ritual, that we can set some rituals for the way we're going to have conversation. No one would desecrate that space that Rabbi Holtzman created because it's sacred. And I know this team, the people listening understand that sacred just means set apart for the purposes of heaven. I mean, that's exactly right. So what are the rituals that that anyone would want to really embody? When I look at the workbook that we will be talking about, and that is available to everybody, there are 5 principles. The ritual of taking winning and losing off the table. This is not a sports endeavor. I'm not trying to shoot the final hoop. The winning and losing means that I've got to defeat somebody. And if I start out wanting to defeat, there is no room for argument or conversation. The prioritize relationships and listen passionately. If I am listening to you, not to change you, but to understand the way the conversation is going to go forward is just different. This is all in the handbook. Pay attention to context. So my mom was born in 1921 in Mississippi, an African-American woman whose father was born just after slavery was over, my grandfather. So whenever she started talking about power dynamics, something in her shifted. And she went back to the things she had learned and the way she learned to survive in Aberdeen, Mississippi in the 20s and 30s and 40s. And so what would look like fearful to somebody else was her way of surviving. We can't look at someone's fear or anger and just assume. There's a context to it that shifts the conversation. So paying attention to the context that is external and the context that's internal, practicing vulnerability. There's a difference in being right and wise, and we have privileged right over wise every time. Be wise. Right's not so good because it divides us. And then the last one is to make room for transformation. And that's back to that ritual. What's the setting? What's the room in me I'm entering in order to be able to have this dialogue? And can I invite you to come into that room, or can I come into yours? And this sacred container, that this conversation is so important and so sacred. And friends, that does not happen in the outside of the context of relationship. And I just want to say one more thing. And I thought about this with my mom. My parents were both from Mississippi, so they were both agrarian. They were both from farm families. And my my mom would talk about the difference in, I'm going to use Dr. King's phrase, the fierce urgency of now. That wasn't her phrase, but the fierce urgency of now as compared to a growing season. If I plant a seed, I don't care about the fierce urgency of now. That seed takes time. So we have to balance the fierce urgency of being engaged and knowing that sometimes our job is only to plant a seed and we might not be there when it blossoms. What is that Chinese proverb that the true soul plants trees whose fruit they will never eat? Sometimes that's our job. And sometimes it's the fierce urgency of now. So I really commend the workbook because I think it sets that sacred space that Rabbi Holzman so beautifully described.
And I just want to jump in and say one thing here, that the issues that we're dealing with as a country right now, when Reverend Jock talks about how long it takes for a seed to germinate and grow, we're dealing with core fundamental issues of who we are as a country. And on top of that, we're dealing with a global pandemic. On top of that, we're dealing with a potential, dysfunction of our global climate system. Okay, this is not small stuff that's going to get resolved in one Wednesday night, 6 p.m. discussion. So how do we cultivate systems that perpetuate these conversations and make progress over long periods of time? One thing I love about faith communities is we're used to thinking about millennia. We think in terms of the Messiah, that's long range. That's what we do. So that gives us an advantage in these kind of problems.
Yes.
Yeah. No, this is all so good and so rich. Thank you both for just putting the truth on the loose today. I hope our participants are enjoying this. There is wisdom oozing up out of this webinar from both of these folks. They are helping us today. And so I'm really thankful for everything that has been said. And we're going to move now to a time of question and answer from the audience. Listen, if both of you could help me out, we're going to do rapid fire responses so that we get to as many of these as possible. Is that okay? Can we do that? I want to try to get to as many of these. If you put your question in the chat, can you find the Q&A function on there and put it there? That helps us to keep these in order. That way I see who submitted a question first so that we have some process of trying to honor those who ask questions in time fashion. So please do that. I'm starting with a question from Eric Gross, who says, what are your suggestions about how to respond to apparently outrageous statements on social media, in principal places like Facebook? He said that, not me. Is there a way to phrase a response that is clear but not stimulating further division? Who wants to take that? Jump in, whoever wants to.
Go ahead, Rabbi Holzman.
Oh, I was pointing to you. So I'll be quick. I'm not a real fan of social media. My congregation knows that. The way I would respond is to seek complexity, to find out what is in that statement that's outrageous, and invite that individual to go deeper on what exactly did you mean by this, and let's talk about it offline. Let's invite a group together to be in person, face to face. And now geography is not an issue. We are all used to this format. And let's go deep in a way that's contained and sacred, like we've been talking about, to get beyond the tweet or beyond the short polarizing statement.
Amen.
Amen. All right. Let's go to the next one. Thank you for that. Michael Hallman asks, how many of the conversations that we should be having or want to have are wrapped in underlying historical power dynamics? And the question is, how can that fact be accounted for as we seek to create a table where many voices are welcome and heard? Rev Xena, you want to?
Not everybody's got the same set of skills and talents. And I think at the same moment, you need agitators, peacemakers, and in the middle, bridge builders. And so what role do you play, and where can you find a partner who will help play the other role? And then together invite people to that table. This starts in small groups. So we have to seek out those conversation partners that we want to have, and we have to bring to the table a multiplicity of gifts and skills. A conversation with 3 or 4 people is enough with which to begin.
There you go. Thank you. That's deep. There's another question. This would be also one of my questions. I've seen how this plays out in community sometimes. How can you invite disagreement while honoring people's non-negotiables, particularly when it comes to religious beliefs? I've been in communities where people have said, well, you know, I'm fine, but when you cross that line, I can't go there with you, can't be in community. How do we deal with non-negotiables in this idea of disagreement?
Rabbi Holtzman, I have a short one. There's a gentleman who is a professor at Perkins School of Theology. His name is Abraham Smith. He was my New Testament professor. And Dr. Smith used to say, you don't have to buy it, but I need you to rent it for the next 30 minutes. And this notion of, remember when you were preparing for Lincoln Douglas debate and you had to argue the other side? It's that fundamental. So I don't want you to, you don't have to buy it, but would you live in this space with me for this short period of time and tell me what happens in your heart? And if that person can just open a tiny bit, and it happens to me when someone says to me, same thing, but try it on. That's back to that word practice. Try it on. And let's just live with me in this space for a moment.
Rabbi Holtzman, were you trying to say something there?
No, I love that response. I would go to, there are certain things that are non-negotiable for all of us. I would try and find something superordinate that's above and beyond everybody's non-negotiables. And that's that we're all human beings. We're all created in the image of God. So what can we do given your non-negotiable and my non-negotiable? And you know, we're dealing with this right now in our local community because there's been some debate about Israel and Palestine. I mean, you want to find a hard topic, right? And how do we engage across? And we have very close personal relationships with our Muslim community here. So we have a room of Jews, a room of Muslims sitting together talking about Israel and Palestine. Okay, how do we recognize each other's humanity and start with that and work from there? I mean, that's, you know, we're all creating the image of God. We keep repeating that.
Yes.
All right. Another question from Carol and Janie. How can better arguments be an opportunity to invite people to bring their full selves, including their faith, to their communities and conversations?
Reverend?
The question makes me sad because it means that people haven't been able to bring their full selves. And I would want someone to say, this is who I am, and this is how I wish to be received, and find the intersectionality where, you know, like this is no joke. If I'm in a room where I feel like I'm threatened, I'll find somebody else with glasses. You know, I'm looking for the place where we have something in common so that I can start there and then move into maybe those broader spaces. But everyone deserves the right to bring their full selves into that conversation because, as Rabbi Holtzman just said, that's how you were created by the God who loves you.
And I also think that we have to be honest that, like, sometimes our communities are intolerant. Like sometimes, I mean, one of our members of our congregation, you know, came to me and said, you know, I don't tell anybody my political affiliation because I will lose all my friends here. And I've heard comments at we call it the Oneg Shabbat, the after services, you know, snacks. I've heard people make jokes about Republicans here. I'm not going to tell anybody I'm a Republican. I mean, so I think we have to be willing to confront our own intolerance in our own institutions, and be honest about it sometimes.
Yeah. To that point, Eric Foreman asks, what have been your experiences in raising your points with clergy who are not ready, I'm going to add, or willing to hear your theses or your point of view? So what about the clergy folks?
I don't have it with me, but I have a card, a business card that's got just Venn diagrams on it. Remember those from if you're of a certain age? And I created it just for me when the pastor who baptized me when I was at the age of 7, about 15 years ago, told me that he was so disappointed in me that I didn't listen to him because I'm a clergy woman and he doesn't believe in women clergy. And I whipped out my little card and said, you know what, you're right. You're green over here and I'm yellow over here, but we both love Jesus and that's the blue in the middle. And so you can stay your yellow and I'm gonna stay my green, but we both love Jesus. So I'm gonna hold on to our relationship because of that. Yeah. It is not satisfactory. We're not gonna be on a committee together of promoting women in ministry, but I still want to find that space where we intersect. And here's the thing, it is above my pay grade to convince anybody of anything. My job is to live before them in such a way that my arguments are so compelling that they can't ignore them. The rest of that work for me is the Holy Spirit's area. But I have to live an authentic and compelling life and make authentic and compelling arguments so that that seed gets planted. And with my brother clergy, particularly who have some differences with me, I keep saying, then just pray for me and we'll figure it out in heaven, because I'm not going to stop.
There you go. So Tess asked, really this is a question about coming out of this, and I'm using this very loosely, coming out of this time of pandemic and quarantine, even though I know the pandemic isn't over. I want to say that, but as many people are becoming more comfortable coming out, there has been a period of isolation for many people. And the question is, how do we have strong communities that I suppose help people who feel isolated? And I guess the way that relates to our conversation is, what do you say to the person who's in isolation, who's isolated themselves from conversation and relationship? Like, what are you talking about? How can we get them to want to feel more comfortable rejoining community, and how do we make them more comfortable, if that question makes sense?
Well, I would love to take this one, if you don't mind, Reverend. I think that we are just barely scratching the surface of what kind of trauma people have experienced through this pandemic. And that's going to play out for different people in different ways at different stages of life, teenagers versus parents of little kids versus elderly people who live on their own. I mean, everybody's had a different kind of trauma in this pandemic. So what we have to do is we have to appeal again to the values that transcend pandemic, the values that we build our faith communities upon, that are much older than any pandemic, that have been through multiple pandemics. These values have been around for centuries. We've seen pandemics before, and encourage people to engage in those kind of communities that provide structure and foundation and anchor in tumultuous times. I also want to say that the pandemic has forced us, especially us people in power, to see the way in which our society is broken. It's forced us to look at things that we prefer not to look at, and we keep out of sight. And I'm talking mostly about racial inequity, that the pandemic and of course, the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and all the things that have happened in the past 18 months, we can't look away. And, American democracy is built to some degree on keeping those things invisible, keeping them out of sight. Thomas Jefferson, when he built Monticello, he built these dumbwaiters that would allow the enslaved people to remain behind a wall, but still provide service. So no one could see that there was slavery happening. I mean, that's ridiculous. The pandemic has said, no, we now see America clearly. This is who we are. If we're going to be proud about being Americans, then let's take that seriously. Let's make it something that we value. And coming out of this pandemic, join into a project of building something that we can all get behind. That's for me, that's where I'm going. And this is where the John Philip Sousa starts to play, So.
There you go. Well, Reverend Xena, I think this question is for you from Deb. You mentioned Krista Tippett. And for those who may not be familiar, she has a wonderful organization called On Being, does a lot of work related to this and other things related to faith and culture and other things. But you mentioned they want to know more about her rules for argument.
So Krista Tippett has something. If you Google the Civil Conversations Project, you will get her 6 guidelines. Adventurous civility, for instance, is one of the 6. And so this is a shameless plug. Let me say that. In Barrington, Illinois, which I've already described, we started a project called courageouscommunities.us. We recognized there was a real absence of diversity here, and yet our younger generations, high school students, were clamoring for a kind of reckoning with the absence of engagement with diversity, inclusion, and equity in their education and in their lives. And so we, 3 years ago now, we started this project called Courageous Communities. And we've had every second Wednesday of the month for 9 months every year, speakers come in, and we used the Civil Conversations Project rules as ways to engage in topics and conversations at our tables. So we have had presentations around of income disparity, around healthcare disparity, around how to listen and deport yourself when your blood pressure starts to rise in the midst of this conversation. We have had conversations about your net worth and what it means to be a citizen in this country if you have power and if you have money. So if you go to courageouscommunities.us, you'll find it. And all 3 years are chronicled there. You can actually see what we've done. And we have reached over 1,500 people with this project to start practicing how to have these conversations around topics that are complicated. But Krista Tippett was our kickoff in May 2018. She came and spoke to us about why this work was important.
Yeah, thank you. Let's go to, we have time for just a couple more. So Robbie had a question, I think it's a good one, about how would you suggest doing this work with people who don't know each other and don't necessarily trust each other and don't share one another's values. So how do you do it when there is no trust among folks?
Well, that is hard. That is hard. I mean, I personally believe you don't start diving into deep water. You start floating, what Reverend Jock said. But let's float together for a little while. Let's get to know each other. Let's trust that we can float together, and then we go deep. I don't think you can walk into a room cold and say, oh, okay, let's live by the same values and just immediately jump in. I think it takes a little bit of time to be human first. I really worry that masking means we don't see each other's faces. So the pandemic has taught us we need to wear masks sometimes. I think seeing faces and sharing food, these basic human things, begin the process of getting us to harder conversations. So start slow.
This is years ago in Boston, and I don't know where my sister is. Rabbi Toba Spitzer was a colleague in Boston. And we took the members of Union Baptist Church, a traditional Black Baptist church, and Rabbi Spitzer's synagogue, and we studied together the first 15 chapters of Exodus, because the Exodus story is central, certainly in the lives of our Jewish brothers and sisters, but also in the lives of African Americans. And it taught us every topic that was going to come up in our later activities came up in that study, and the way we own those texts. But I never thought of it, Rabbi Holzman, it was that safe vessel, because we met half the time at the synagogue and half the time at our church. And then we met at a peace organization for our last meal together. And work continued beyond that, but we started in this joyful textual study. And we floated, we got to know each other.
Oh, that's beautiful. Rabbi Holzman, I'm going to ask you to respond quickly to one more of these questions, and then we're going to bring our time to a close. I'm really sorry we didn't get a chance to answer all of the questions. We had so many. This conversation was just bringing up so many good questions from people, but hopefully some of the resources in terms of both of the reports that are in the chat and the other resources that have been shared will help to address some of these questions. But the last question here I have is, it says, why do they always seem to be worst case scenarios that people have in terms of making their point, rather than beginning with more reasonable statements? So I guess the question is, what is there a role of just of positivity and of thinking about positive outcomes in this idea of better arguments instead of a sort of idea of worst case scenarios? That's a question. And I'll give that to you, Rabbi Holzman, to close us out.
Well, I go back to my tradition, beginning with the destruction of the temple and having to construct something out of destruction and out of despair. And so there's a little story of a rabbi who encounters some people who refused to eat meat because it used to be that you had to sacrifice it in the temple. They can't sacrifice no meat. And then he says, okay, well, what about vegetables? You have to bring first fruits. You can't eat the fruits. And, so they say, well, we'll get by with water. He's like, but there's a water ritual. You got to do the water ritual. And they're like, well, what are we going to do? And he says, if you focus only on the worst case, then you'll get nowhere. It's impossible to live. If you acknowledge that there is brokenness, you start off by acknowledging there is brokenness in the world. We all have work to do. Then you can construct something. So I would say, let's acknowledge that nothing's perfect right now. Nobody has got all the answers. Like what Reverend Jack said, I'm humble enough to know that's above my pay grade to have all the answers. Now let's build something and go from there.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. Well, listen, you two are just wonderful gifts to us and gifts to community. And the Inclusive America Project is thankful for all that you bring and for the relationship that we have with you. And thank you to all of our attendees. And I'm going to turn it over now to Seth to close out our conversation. But thank you, Reverend Xena, and thank you, Rabbi Holzman, for a great conversation. Seth, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to take a moment and really thank you, Billy, for moderating this conversation today. Thank you so much, Reverend Jock, for your comments and your insights as well. And thank you, Rabbi Holzman, as well for joining us today. We're really fortunate to have created this workbook that has been shared in the chat with all of you, and we will be sending a follow-up email as well. And I just want to take a moment and thank the partners of the Better Arguments Project, the Inclusive America Project, and the Interfaith Youth Corps. And the Better Arguments Project partners, the Aspen Institute Citizenship and American Identity Program, Facing History and Ourselves, and Allstate. Thank you again so much for joining us today, and we will see you soon. Take care.